Welcome to Chapter 1, the book club review of Surviving a Borderline Parent, How to Heal Your Childhood Wounds and Build Trust, Boundaries, and Self-Esteem. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist who also grew up this way, and we're talking really about the heart of what is often eggshell parents, which can have really a spectrum of untreated borderline, potentially behaviors and patterns, narcissistic ones, and also emotional immaturity, which is really at the heart often parents who might fit in the categories who may have struggled or struggle with some form of borderline or narcissistic behaviors, or just some patterns of immaturity around emotion regulation. And that really is often the heart. The heart of borderline difficulty is emotional and relational instability. That is really what we're going to see. Of course, it plays out in a bunch of different ways. And so in today's review of Chapter 1 of this book, we're going to talk about it and what it can look like. The first part of this is I never knew it had a name, and I mentioned that in yesterday's video, which is that historically, this book was published in 2003. The idea of borderline parents was like this extreme, as I've talked about, caricature of borderline, when in reality, the experience of a parent who is untreated with borderline can really have a wide spectrum. On one end, from a parent who was never at risk in any significant way, but who kind of had these high highs and low lows, and you were the good child and the bad child. You received good love and bad love, and they were impulsive. They could be conditional. They could be chaotic. They could be likely to devalue you one day and idealize you the next, which is very common in really all of the levels of borderline. But the heart of it is that walking on eggshells where you didn't know what to expect. And because this disorder has really been evolving in the last few years, for example, there are some really amazing creators, therapists on TikTok, especially on YouTube, who have been diagnosed with borderline, who are mothers, who are very aware and very open about their struggles. And I want you to know that generation of people talking about borderline, or that population, is a very different population from the highly clinical population historically, where a lot of the research was done on people who had this disorder, which of course we know that women are much more likely to be diagnosed, though because of the trauma basis and the sort of stereotypes around the criteria. I believe that my own father had this disorder alongside other trauma-related disorders around narcissism and bipolar in terms of genetics. So it's really quite vast, and that's what I want you to get from these videos, is that there is a very wide spectrum of behaviors. But if we're talking about the reality of this disorder in terms of the current criteria in the DSM, let's go through just the heart of what it looks like. So if we're talking about a diagnosis in borderline, for example, don't forget that you must have 5 of the 9 criteria offered to have the diagnosis. And in my experience, it really is an evolution that has been there throughout the person's life in terms of how it showed up maybe in their teen years and things like that. But we also know that we go through different periods of life and they bring out different parts of ourselves. But when we're talking about understanding this disorder from a lens, and those of you who are here, I know many of you were here as I initially came to present, which is I grew up this way with a parent like this and had no idea. It took me almost a doctorate to understand that, because it did not look like the classic stereotyped descriptions. But the first criteria we have to meet, 1 of 9, is frantic attempts to prevent feelings of actual or perceived abandonment. And abandonment really is the heart of this. And so your parent may never have told you, you can't leave me, but they made themselves indispensable to you. They made you feel like if you left them, they could never take care of themselves, or they'll never be able to handle life on their own. They may have put you in the role of therapist or best friend or savior or partner. And so there's an underlying belief that you have to always be taking them into account physically, mentally, or emotionally, or they won't be able to handle it. And that really is that. The first sentence here says, owing to a poorly defined sense of self, people with BPD rely on others for their feelings of worth and emotional caretaking. So fearful are they of feeling alone that they may act in desperate ways that quite frequently bring about the very abandonment and rejection they're trying to avoid, and which therefore validates and reinforces their fears. This is really important. So one of the first criteria is that this fear of abandonment is huge for them. And it drives so much of their behavior that what often happens is, because of that fear, they actually end up pushing people away. And this is the really heartbreaking part about having this diagnosis and not understanding it, or being aware or receiving treatment, is that the thing they fear the most will end up happening, like no contact, for example. So for a borderline parent who was just so desperately wanted to be a part of their child's life, but behaved in ways, I'm talking about untreated. This whole series we're talking about untreated and typically undiagnosed and a lack of awareness, that when the adult child does reject them, they're like, see, I knew they were always going to do that. Really, therefore, validating their belief system, but minimizing their role and why the child may have done that. And that is why I think a lot of parents who are so angry about this generation going no contact don't understand what's happened is that they always feared it. And when you push that button and say, yes, I did, they get very defensive about thinking that, well, how dare you? I'm your mother, right? And yet what they've always feared was that you would go no contact with them. And when you do it, it's all about what you did to them. Oftentimes they might have little moments where they can see their behavior, but the core and what keeps it often in a bad place is that they don't understand the role that they've played. And that goes back to really all personality disorders, I'm going to say PDs, personality disorders, is a real lack of insight and awareness. That's the heart of so many of these disorders, is that they really don't necessarily think it is themselves. And so they do tend to project and blame you and the world and relationships and others. And that's why I also hope if you watch these videos and you're like, oh my gosh, I have some of these traits, that you'll think about getting support. And I will list some more resources down below around receiving treatment for borderline also. Okay, number 2, patterns of relationships that are intense and unstable. Repeated tendencies to shift between extremes of loving and hating another person. This is another very common part of borderline, and also can happen in narcissism, is this splitting between good or bad, right or wrong, you're all good, you're all bad, they're all good, they're all bad. And really it is about them having a hard time owning and holding on to their own, I would say, yucky feelings, and trying to split them off from themselves and put them onto you. And so that's why you can be accused of the very things that they do, like lying, cheating, stealing, whatever it is. They have a lot of those negative feelings inside they can't tolerate. Going back to, if I feel all those, I'm a bad person, I'll be abandoned, so I'll put them on you. And so the way this plays out for you is that these takeaways I'm going to read from this book says, if I do such and such, I'll get back into the good graces of the parent. So then you often start to split in yourself. This is also very common for us as children. Things are good or bad, right or wrong, black or white, all or nothing. People are heroes, or if they have some flaw, they're villains, allies or enemies. There's no gray area, no middle ground. I'm worshipped. If I continue to do what my parent wants, I'll continue to be the favorite. I'm despised. I need to try harder to be better so that I'll be worthy of being loved. Or I'm worthless, so why even bother? One day I'm loved, the next day I'm hated. The world is an inconsistent place and I have little or no control over what happens or how others treat me. So that often happens to us as children, right? We think, well, this is just how it is. If your primary caregiver very commonly split on you from some combination of immaturity, borderline, or narcissistic behaviors, which are often the most common ones that do this, that becomes your template of how the world works. And so that's what you believe. Number 3, difficulty describing the self, interests, or aspirations, frequent shifts in self-perception. So really this is a constant shifting of identity for borderline oftentimes. Who am I? What's my place in the world? And it can feel confusing for you. And so what's basically happening here is that you don't really know what to expect. This can go back to walking on eggshells. Like today they're this version, tomorrow they're that version. And so it can be their true identity in terms of their job or how they dress or they see themselves, or it may just be in sort of how they show up in the world, where it just feels like there's no real wholeness and consistency to that. And so that can play out for us in terms of like, this person isn't real, they're gonna consume me, I can't hold on to what they say today because it's gonna change tomorrow. That ourselves should be fluid and constantly changing. We all wear masks, and what we present to the world isn't necessarily related to who we are. So that's the impact for you. Number 4, impulsive, often reckless behaviors. This can be things like addictions, shopping, whatever it is, promiscuity, shoplifting, reckless driving. It really is this impulsivity that can play out. It can play out in, moving different places, them changing jobs. It can play out in how they just manage themselves. But the impulsivity can force you to feel like you have to take care of them, that it's your job to stop their impulsivity, that if you were better, then maybe they wouldn't act out and do these things because you upset them, they went and did something risky, or that you have, no influence or too much influence on another person. Number 5, repeated attempts for self-wounding. I'm not going to go into that here, but that's obviously a definite possibility, and this disorder, the risks are much higher for those issues. But the bottom line is that you may have a parent who, yes, it's very clear that these things happen, and it was a constant up or down in terms of the self dynamics, or it may be that your parent this was just not one of the criteria, and that's the problem in the highly clinical population. And because of the higher risk, this is definitely an issue. But it doesn't mean that if your parent never engaged in these types of things, that they don't have this disorder. Number 6, frequent mood swings and intense emotional reactions, irritability or anxiety of changing duration, anywhere from a few hours to a few days. So this relational and emotional, this is part of that mood swing. So it's like the emotional flip-flopping, the back and forth. You never know what to expect. This is the heart of the eggshell, really, the emotional and relational instability that is the heart of borderline. So it plays out in having to notice subtle cues and shifts in people's faces and moods and minds and their tone of voice, that you can't trust what people say, it might change, that you could be in trouble one minute and so love the next minute, that it's easier to just never feel the good things because you know the bad things are coming, so you can't even take good feedback or good love. It's better to not get excited or feel good about circumstances or accomplishments because my happiness may trigger a violent reaction in the parent. Number 7, ongoing or frequent feelings of being hollow, empty, or fake. That's a very common, the sense of emptiness is very common for people with borderline who struggle. And so the way it plays out for you as a child is that you can't rely on them, that they're not there for themselves, let alone you, that you have to keep quiet and protect the parent in some way, that you're responsible for the emptiness. So when they don't feel empty, that's your job to help keep that going or some way, to fill them up when they feel depleted. That it's your job as a child to make the parent feel whole. And when you think about the fear of abandonment, oftentimes I think it's difficult because many of these parents, when they finally have their own child, it's like, oh, I finally have control over another person not leaving me. And so I'm going to give them all of this love and keep them here, and then I'll always have someone to love me. And a part of that, I think we all love our kids and want to have that connection, but when it goes down that road, it's really a very imbalanced, unhealthy dynamic for the child, and the child really feels that responsibility. Number 8, either underexpressed or overexpressed feelings of anger, seen in frequent displays of temper, rage. So quick rage is the bottom line here. So we can see a quick to anger temper, and that also really goes back and connects to the eggshell dynamic. And here's an example where the person says, I wasn't allowed to be angry as a child. Whenever I raise my voice, almost always in response to some untrue accusation of manipulating my mom in some way, I was banished to my room. Then we'd get the silent treatment. So the bottom line is you start to tiptoe on the eggshells around their anger. And the flip side is they often will have no tolerance for yours. And as I've said, because of their hair trigger temper, if that's one of their characteristics, that they really determine the temperature of the home. And that is the heart of eggshell as well. We can also see the takeaways here being I can't express my feelings, especially anger. Anger is not safe, it's dangerous. I have to watch what I say or I can make the parent angry. Rage and the contrition cycle are so quick, they don't seem to be related. So feelings seem random and not even in response to things, because the truth is what can set them off literally can just make no sense to you. It might, but it might not. And so if you have that over and over and over again, it's like you just never know what to expect. You are living in the chronic state of hypervigilance I talk about so much because you have to. And number 9, extreme periods of mistrust, paranoia, or feelings of unreality, numbness, disconnection. While we know, of course, dissociation can be very common, or even like a sort of a triggered psychosis for this disorder, I think a lot of what happens in the more kind of, general category is oftentimes when they get angry, they kind of dissociate and they will say and do things that they swear later that they never said or did. And you're like, yeah, yes, you did. And I'm not saying they don't necessarily know sometimes what they've said, that they don't always remember it, but I think there's a large place at times where they truly don't remember it because they kind of had an out-of-body experience in their rage, in their wounding. And that can be crazy making you as a child or as an adult when you're like, but you said this. And they're like, no, I didn't. And so where does this leave you? Oftentimes you can have a different reality. I remember different realities in your parents, and they seem so sure that they never said it that you may be you might start to question yourself, like, maybe I didn't hear that. So that can make you question your own reality. You can think that you misinterpreted things, you can't trust your own judgment, you just don't understand people, or that if you are perfect all the time, the book says, if I do everything right, I won't be subject to false accusation. So this false accusation thing is very common with these parents who are untreated. So they're accusing you of trying to hurt them, trying to steal from them, lying to them, whatever it is, doing and saying things that you just, like I've said, you're just like, wait, what? How could you think that? Like, don't you know who I am as your child? And the last part is you have to always prove your case to people. You have to keep notes and document things. And so, it gets to be where you think, I need to record this conversation. If I could record it, you would believe what you said to me. And like I've said, everything I just described is what your personality development required, your armor to have a parent like this. This way of going through the world is significant. If you believe that at the core, people can't be trusted, that they will say and do things that they're not going to own up to, that they blame you, judge you, shame you, that you're worthy of good love, that you're not worthy of good love, that is why I think we need to talk so much more about this dynamic. And that's why I like talking about under the guise of eggshell, because of course you can see these same things, parts of these things, in those who have narcissism, who have immaturity, clearly at the core trauma. Although, as I've said in many videos, the research shows so far that up to 20% of those who have this disorder do not necessarily have trauma. So we're also talking about genetics and biology and brain development, things like that. But we do know it's in a large response, as most things are, to trauma in some way. It's just that historically parents haven't known their trauma. I think the newer generation of people who are discussing this disorder publicly often understand that they do have trauma, and that is part of their disorder. And I think that, I hope, validates their struggle. But for so many of us, and that's what I'm really talking about, is if the parent doesn't know it, how can you know it? And so you're going to make up your own beliefs about who you are as a result of who you had to be to survive these kind of parents. And that's the bottom line. So this video is going long, so we'll go tomorrow into what the book talks about, the fairy tale model, which is basically referenced in another book on having a borderline mother specifically. So we're going to continue our book review on the book around surviving a borderline parent. And I will see you tomorrow. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you then. Take care.